Hi, everyone. Welcome to everyone who's here already. We're going to be starting in a few minutes. Welcome, everyone, to this evening's Yoval event. Let's talk about it, an honest conversation about racism, policing, and the role of faith communities. I'm Ora Weinbach, the Jewish Center community educator. And before we begin, I wanted to just take care of a few housekeeping announcements. So first of all, this event is being recorded and live streamed. If you would like to receive a recording of the event, or you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at yoval@jewishcenter.org. The last 15 minutes of our program will be devoted to audience questions. We've already received a bunch of questions through registration, and they have been incorporated into the main body of the program. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function and send all your questions directly to me, and we're going to do our best to get to as many questions as possible. For those of you who might benefit, this event also has closed captioning, which you can access by clicking at the bottom of the screen to activate the live transcript of the event. And for those of you who are with us in the Zoom room, we also strongly recommend that you use the speaker view, which is at the top right of your Zoom screen. This evening, I am so honored to be joined by Officer Anthony Campbell. Officer Campbell was born right here in New York City, in Harlem. He attended the Fordham Preparatory High School, where he was valedictorian, and then attended Yale University, where he made the life-changing decision to change his major from electrical engineering to religious studies and counseling and psychology. He later returned to Yale to earn his master's in divinity, which is the same degree program that I myself am currently pursuing. He is a deeply committed Christian and preaches regularly at his church. He joined the New Haven Police Department and rose in the ranks to become chief of police of New Haven. And during his tenure as chief of police, New Haven experienced record-setting levels of crime reduction. He is a relationship builder, successfully identifying and developing collaborative efforts that have addressed both criminal behavior and its root causes. He's also trained in counterterrorism, which I believe included a trip to Israel. Now, Officer Campbell is Yale's assistant chief of police, and most importantly, my professor. This past semester, I took his course at Yale Divinity School, and as you are all about to discover, he is an unbelievably engaging teacher, a passionate and compassionate human being who has so much to share with us about the complex issues which now lays heavily on many of our hearts. Officer, Professor, Chief Campbell, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Aura, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone who is here to participate. This is truly an honor for me, so thank you. And thank you for the great introduction. I would like to meet that guy. He sounds incredible.
So thank you so much for joining us. I think the best way probably for us to start is to just learn a little bit about you. If you wouldn't mind sharing your life story from kind of your perspective. Where did you come from and how did you end up where you are?
Sure. Well, you've encapsulated a lot of it, but as you said, I was born in 1973 right there in Harlem Hospital in New York City. My mom was 16 at the time. My dad was 17. And ultimately, I was raised in Harlem at 125th Street and Madison Avenue. That's where I grew up. And we grew up in an apartment building. But ultimately, it was a unique life growing up because my parents were so young that I was primarily raised by my great-grandparents. And many people who encounter me say I have an old soul, and I think that's a big part of it. Ultimately, as I grew up, my parents saw that I was pretty intelligent and kept me in school and kept me out of the streets. My mother, ultimately, when I was 12, joined the New York City Department of Corrections and became a corrections officer. And my father, on the other hand, was always involved in criminal activity. He sold drugs throughout his life. Started out with marijuana. Ultimately, in the 90s, he was selling crack cocaine. And so you got to imagine this weird picture of me reaching this place where I'm attending Fordham Preparatory School in the Bronx. I have been taught by the Jesuits. I've fallen in love with religion. And ultimately, I decide that I want to be a Jesuit priest and go to Yale University and teach ultimately as a Jesuit priest. But my family is struggling because my dad is selling drugs. My mom is working as a corrections officer. And so when I leave home at 18 years old, I come to Yale University with the goal of becoming a Jesuit priest, but God in his infinite wisdom, the following year brought this incredible woman that I met on old campus. And that woman has now been my wife for 22 years. So once I realized I wasn't going to be a Jesuit priest, I'm like, well, what am I going to do now? I decided that I was going to switch my major to religious studies. And ultimately, I graduated in 1995 and decided, well, maybe I'll do prison ministry. But unfortunately, 7 months after I graduated from Yale, and December 16th of 1995, my father committed suicide. And sad to say, he committed suicide with my mother's service weapon from the Department of Corrections. So you can imagine, I'm 22 years old. My father's committed suicide. I'm devastated. I decide, well, I'm really gonna help my mom out as much as I can, get some therapy, get some healing. And during that time, I decided, you know what, I think I'm gonna do prison ministry because when my father was alive, whenever he was in jail and he read the scriptures, he seemed to get right with God. He seemed to make that connection with the divine, and he seemed to be okay. But the problem was he was released from prison to the same environment, which ultimately put him in prison. And I said, if I could work within the prison system to help people to transition into a community of faith and help communities of faith to reach those people in prison, then maybe I could break that cycle. Right around that time, I told my mother what I was going to do. She said, well, I've been working in the prison system for about 20 years, and maybe you want to meet people before they go to prison, help them up front. At that time, I was living in New Haven, and I saw on the side of a bus a little kiosk advertising for hiring for the New Haven Police Department. It had an African American female officer in uniform, and the caption said, "Police others as you would have others police you." Well, of course, that just grabbed me. That was like, what? And so I started a journey which led me to ultimately join the New Haven Police Department in 1998, climb the ranks and become the chief in 2016, and then ultimately retire in 2019. So that's my journey. That's how I got to where I am. And that's the bulk of who I am. I'm also, been married to my beautiful wife, Stephanie, who I met at Yale University. She's a stay-at-home mom. And we have three boys. My oldest is 19, the middle one is 17, and the youngest is 11 years old. And they keep us busy. It's the reason I don't have much hair these days.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us about your kind of personal life experience. And it strikes me that you really are uniquely situated to answer some of the questions that we are about to spend kind of a year thinking about together. And so I wanted to know if you could just start us off with, some easy topics and share with us from your many vantage points how you understand the terms systemic racism and white privilege.
Sure. Systemic racism. It is a multifaceted term. People think of systemic racism. Of course, you had the overt systemic racism of chattel slavery. When it comes to an end at the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln frees the slaves. For most people, that is the end of systemic racism. But systemic racism has persisted, and it persists to this day. It persists in many of the behind the scenes things that impact people of color and impact so many other people, not just Black people, but systemic racism is basically anything that keeps those who were in power when the system was established is what systemic racism is. And that encompasses everything from the fact that, you had to have cases like Brown versus the Board of Education to create, to distinguish. Originally, there was the thought of separate but equal. To this day, we know that many people of color, many different communities do not have the same type of education that is afforded to others. We know that there is a disparity between earnings in people of color and others in this country. We also know that systemic racism persists in not just education, but in medical care. And it's across the board where systemic racism exists. And it is not simply, systemic racism doesn't mean that you have an employer or an educator or an environment where someone is using the N-word or some other pejorative term. It is when any group is held back by the system that is in place. And I think that it ties into white privilege. And white privilege is simply anything that an individual who happens to be white has access to that someone who is a person of color would not have access to. For example, I I have pretty decent credit. I have a pension and a good job here at Yale University. So if I want to go get a car, I can go and buy a car. But I know that as a Black man, I am more likely to pay more money to get that car because I'm a Black man. So if I wanted to, I have many white friends that I could call and say, hey, I'm thinking about getting a car. I don't want to pay the top price for the car. Would you go in, particularly if it's a white male, and buy the car for me or negotiate the price of the car for me? And they would buy the car. It would be sold to them, and then they could sell it to me for that price. We would transfer it over. The fact that my white male friend, who may have equal credit, may even not even make as much as I do, can get that car for less than what I would have to pay, and definitely less than what my wife, an African American woman, would have to pay, is white privilege. It A lot of times you hear white privilege associated with finances, but white privilege is associated with things that one might take for granted. For instance, if I'm driving somewhere and my vehicle, say, is running low on gas, one would think that, well, I can just go to the gas station and fuel my vehicle up. I've got a credit card, I've got cash. Depending on where I'm driving in the country, I may have to think twice about where I am going to stop, whether it is for gas, whether it is for a hotel room. I have to think a little bit more about where I am, what time of day it is, and if I feel safe, or if it is in fact safe for me to stop to get gas or to rent a room and stay in a certain location. So my white counterpart may be driving and think that they need gas, their gas gauge says they need gas, and they wouldn't even have to think twice about stopping for gas. That is a privilege that they have that I do not. And so a lot of times when you talk with people, they get very defensive when you talk about systemic racism, when you talk about white privilege. It is not saying that someone who is white is bad or wrong just because they are white. It is helping people to educate that there are certain things in this country that certain groups of people have a privilege or access to that others don't, just by their very nature.
Great, thank you. It's really helpful for us to start out in a place where we can kind of define these terms. I'm curious if you could give a little bit of insight from your either personal life experience or your work in policing, where these factors come into play in the work that you do or in the way that you've gone about living your life. So, for example, is there systemic racism, or did you experience systemic racism in the policing system, either in your work or as a Black man? And have you kind of experienced different kinds of privilege or lack thereof in your life, either because of your identity as a Black man or because of your kind of job as a police officer?
That's a great question. And a perfect example is I own a home in New Haven where we have lived for 19 years. And as a police officer, I leave the home in uniform. I come home in uniform. I'm basically always in uniform as a sole source of income for my family. Well, one day I came home and my wife wasn't home with the kids. And I went inside, I did a couple things, and I left. And when I closed the door behind me, I realized that, dang it, I locked my keys in the house. So I'm like, so I called my wife. She was a ways off. I really need to get back to the department. So I realized, well, I know how to get in the house. I mean, there's a window open that I could clearly reach. I'm in uniform. And I decide that, well, I'm going to climb through the window. And, it's my house. And go through the window and just grab my keys. So I start walking around the back of the property to get a garbage can so that I could stand on the garbage can, to get up to the window, to push the window open, to climb through the window. So of course I do this. And by the time I get through the window, go downstairs, grab the keys, I hear the sirens. I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me. So someone has called the police. So I'm like, this shouldn't be a problem. It's my home. I'm in uniform. It's a big department, but it's not so big that people won't know who I am. So I come downstairs, and of course, the police are there. I open the door. I'm in uniform. They're like, did you see anyone inside? I said, just calm down. It's my house. I was the one who climbed through the window. So the officers who were on scene were like, oh, okay. But the supervisor who arrived was kind of an old school cop. And he saw me and said, what are you doing in there? I said, this is my home. So he says, oh, so you were the one who climbed through the window? I said, yeah. So he was like, do you have any identification? Well, the moment he said that, I was like, are you serious, Sarge? And he was like, yeah, we just have to make sure we document that at your house. I said, I'm in full uniform. I opened the door from the inside. Those are my pictures up on the mantle. And you want identification from me? And he was dead serious. Yeah, I need identification. So I showed him the identification. And later, after he left with the officers, I went and I spoke to the chief at the time. And the chief, in a very wise way, who happened to be a Hispanic officer at the time, said to me, Tony, something you need to understand. People in this department know who you are. They know that you went to Yale University. They know that you are climbing the ranks in this department rather quickly. And they don't always like that. You threaten them. Should that man have asked you for your identification? Absolutely not. Would he have asked anyone else for their identification? Probably not. But you know what's going on, and you know exactly why he did it. You're safe. I'll deal with this, and we'll go from there. And those are the types of things, as I climbed the ranks through the police department, that I had to deal with, including becoming the chief with another person who was a rival for the position. Anything that he could think of to try and stop me from getting that position, he tried. And he was unsuccessful, and it was done unanimously by the Board of Alders, which has never happened before. But that is some of the things that I had to overcome, and which continues to this day in the 21st century.
Thank you for sharing that story with us. That sounds really upsetting. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and ask you about an amalgamation of questions that all relate to the protests which took place this summer after the murder of George Floyd. I'm wondering if you can speak, just share your thoughts on the nature of the protests, both the peaceful protests and the violent protests, and share a little bit about what you think the role of the police should be in protests that are about the police.
Sure. Well, I think, like almost anyone who has a heart and who has any connection with another human being, I was heartbroken to watch George Floyd be murdered by a uniformed police officer. Not only was it heartbreaking to watch this man have the life literally suffocated out of him, but was also, what was atrocious was watching other uniformed police officers stand by while this happened. And when the protests began, which we knew was going to happen, I think anyone who watched what happened to George Floyd knew the protests were coming. I felt, as I have with many other terrible situations where people of color have lost their lives at the hands of police officers, particularly those who were unarmed and lost their lives to the hands of police officers, I thought to myself, well, maybe this time the protests will lead to significant change. I had had that same thought in 2014 with Eric Garner, and shortly thereafter with Freddie Gray. And the list goes on and on. But the thing about these protests that I really felt was significant is that these protests, I think, were organized in such a way that it the timing, believe it or not, was right. And the timing, along with COVID, led to a situation where people normally, particularly in America, we're constantly going. There's a constant rat race. Something terrible happens, you kind of look at it and go, that's bad, but I need to keep moving forward. COVID slowed everything down so that these protests were seen by so many more people in a different way than they had been seen before. People who normally didn't come out and protest were out protesting. And I think that the peaceful protests really sent a message across the nation, and truth be told, across the world. Um, there are numerous situations that are documented that people from Britain to Australia were bringing up George Floyd's death and the protests that were going on and talking about police reform. And I think that as a result of the protests, local, state, and national police reform has really started to take hold. And the peaceful protests I support completely. I will never advocate for violent protests or protests that destroy property, but I do understand them. I understand that after 400 years, someone someone used the example of if we were playing Monopoly and I had a piece and I'd go around the board and every time I pass go, I'm supposed to get $200. I don't get the $200, but you do. After a certain amount of time, I'm going to be like, this is really frustrating. This is frustrating, but I'm on the board. I'm playing the game. There will come a time where I'm going to get that $200. Well, after you see enough George Floyd situations, you reach a place where the frustration is so great that you feel like, I just want to do something. Now, in a constructive way, you can peacefully protest, you can vote, you can write to your state rep and Congress and say, we want change to happen. But if you have been denied a good education, if you are limited in the jobs that you can have, if you get subpar medical treatment, if where you live will probably lead to your life expectancy being significantly lower than others, and most importantly, you've known all of this, since you were 7 or 8 years old, there's a time where people riot and they go out and they destroy things. And then many times, if you watch them looting, they're doing it out of a sense of frustration, but they're also doing it because they know this may be the only time that they will have access to something that otherwise they won't have access to. Most people who know that they could work towards something, that they have a genuine opportunity to go for something, that sense of I'm going to go out and do something destructive doesn't reach a place where it will lead to looting and destruction. But I understand why people were violently protesting. I don't support it, but I understand it.
Thank you. I really appreciate the compassion that you're bringing to this conversation, especially because, right, as a police officer, you and your coworkers were standing kind of on quote unquote the other side of the line, and so I'm curious to hear from you what that felt like, or what maybe some of your colleagues felt and experienced, and again to kind of reiterate the question of what is the role of police in protests, peaceful and violent, that really are targeted against them.
As a police officer, you always know that your job is to help people, to protect them, to serve them, and to uphold the Constitution. That is what is so unique about our democracy. We don't pledge our allegiance to a chief, to a department, or even a president. We pledge our allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. And so even though when these protests were happening, and many of them happened right here in New Haven, at one point we have 1,000 students outside the police department protesting us, I understand why they are protesting. They are protesting because they're frustrated with a system that has been in place for a long time that doesn't work the way it's supposed to. We all know how it's supposed to work. We all know how the criminal justice system is supposed to work, that it's supposed to be equal and equitable, but it doesn't really work that way. And when people witness police officers who are supposed to protect and serve taking the lives of an unarmed, handcuffed man, there is a heartbreak that happens. And so you understand that what they're protesting not you as an individual, they're protesting what policing stands for at this point in time in 21st century America. And so we support them. We support them in by making sure that when they're going to march through the streets, we block the streets so that they can march through and not have to deal with traffic. We create environments like we did here by putting water outside, because at the time they were protesting, it was hot, so they could have something to drink. We make sure that if they want access to myself or the chief to come out and talk about what's really going on and how we feel, we join with them in calling for reform. And I think that any department that is angry at protesters after watching what happened really needs to get with the times. And as I said before, I may not support violent protests, and it is the job of the police to make sure that we protect life and property. But I think good leaders can really get with the leaders of the protests and say, we want to work with you and walk with you to make sure that we get it right, because we can get it right. I think that process has really begun, and I'm hoping that we won't drop the ball and not only have another George Floyd, but worse. But I think that working with the people who are protesting, helping them to understand, we see you, we understand, and we're going to do everything within our power to protect you and to uphold the Constitution. That's how we're going to make progress.
Thank you. You mentioned a few times police reform, and I wanted to pick up on that thread and ask you a little bit about police reform. Do you think that the police system can be reformed? If so, how? And what are the impediments to that reform? And to follow, I think, like, to just touch specifically on terms that kind of are, floating around in our world, in the papers and the media, the movement to defund the police. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what your attitudes are towards campaigns such as defund the police, and what you would say to someone who believes that the police system can't be fixed.
Sure. An entire group of people in this country have had bad experiences with the police for decades. There have been many programs, community policing itself, the COPS program and others that have been designed to try and reach communities that have not had a good relationship with the police. If you go through a police academy, a traditional police academy, you will learn about Sir Robert Peel, the modern day founder of which I know you know about because I teach on him. You'll learn about Sir Robert Peel. But one thing that most police academies will not teach you is the role that police played during the times of Jim Crow and during the early stages of when there was slavery and when that police were used to round up slaves. And that history still exists. That history still exists within communities of the memory of who the police were, what they did, and what they represented. And so I think to have a well-balanced police department, you have to teach the true history of the police, the good and the bad, so that we can move forward. Defunding the police covers the spectrum. You have those who talk about, well, let's not have police. You know what? In a perfect world, we wouldn't need police. If we, as 350 million Americans, we're all able to work together and have community together, we wouldn't need police. But unfortunately, we live in a country which does not have comprehensive gun laws. And there are a lot of weapons on the street, a lot of weapons on the street. And so if you were to say, get rid of the police, you it would be complete and total chaos. So we know we can't get rid of the police, but what we can do is maybe look at how we are funding the police. The police have become the answer to everything. Oh, someone's mentally ill? Call the police. There's a homeless guy on the corner or hanging around. I don't feel comfortable with that. Call the police. Oh, my neighbor is playing the music too loud and I don't want to go knock on their door and ask them to turn it down. Call the police. Well, the police are not always the best tool to handle most situations. So I believe that part of the defund the police movement should be looking at police budgets and saying, how can we have a differentiated response? Are there other organizations or entities that can respond to the person who's mentally ill, who isn't necessarily violent, and help them? Are there other entities that can deal with the noise complaint? Are there other entities that can deal with the homeless individual rather than the police? And if there are those entities, can we take maybe some of that funding that has been going to the police and put them in the right place? It's about proper allocation. And I think that the defund the police movement, rather than police departments being like, oh, that's just rubbish, that's foolishness, we need to embrace it. We need to embrace it because part of police reform is talking about looking at what have you been doing with the money that you get? How are you truly serving the community, and are you serving the totality of the community? It's putting police departments kind of on their heels and making them stand up and say, what have we been doing? What works? What doesn't work? And how can we do it better? And what partnerships do we need to form? What out of the box ways of thinking do we need to engage in order to get this right? Because we can get it right and we must get it right. So I do believe that you will not hear the end of defunding the police. We've seen that, New York City cut the budget by $1 billion to its police department. There were cuts here in New Haven Police Department. Justin Elliker cut the police department's budget by $4 million. And other departments have had budgets cut for reallocation of funds to other programs. And I think that departments really need to start taking a hard look at themselves. And I think it's, time to stop doing things the way we have for the longest period of time. And I think one of the major obstacles for us in this country is the fact that, you brought up that I went and did some anti-terrorism training in Israel. And the thing that impressed me the most about the Israeli police is that they have one police force, one national police force, one way of training, one way of doing things. In America, you have 18,000 police departments, 18,000 different ways of saying, well, what is use of force for you versus your department versus that department? Use of force means something different in this state versus that state. We don't have one standard, and that is a huge obstacle. We don't have a standard across the board of training. We don't have a standard across the board of monitoring and data collection. So it's hard to even know exactly what's going on. We don't even have a standard of keeping data as to when officers use deadly force. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but it can be done, but that's one of the major obstacles.
Thank you. I wanted to touch on something else that you kind of uniquely bring to the table as a person of faith yourself, and somebody who's deeply embedded in a religious tradition, as are many of the people on this call. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role that religion, faith, and faith communities might be uniquely able to play in these very, very complicated and challenging times, particularly for the people on this call. What perspective can we bring to the table, and what can we uniquely do, learn, and contribute?
I think that people of faith, no matter what your faith is, give me a second, my lights went out. There we go. There we go. Sorry about that. I think that as people of faith, um, we are all in a unique position to bring about the change that I've been talking about. Whenever I look at major change that has happened in this country, I mean, even the formation of this country really came about because people of faith wanted some freedom. When I look at the civil rights movement, a man who was a person of faith, Dr. Martin Luther King, brought about major change in a peaceful way. And I believe that people of faith in this country have the opportunity, like never before, to bring about the change that we're looking for, not just in law enforcement, but just in our entire system. Systemic racism will be changed not by putting more laws on the books, those help, don't get me wrong, but it will be changed primarily by people of faith helping those whose hearts have been calloused, whose hearts have never been touched with compassion and with grace, to understand the reality that when they deny another human being the same rights that they have, when they deny another human being the same privileges that they are in fact harming themselves, harming the larger community, and harming our future. People of faith are recognized across the board, not just by law enforcement, but in politics, in every arena. Faith is power. America, in particular, touts itself as being a religious country. There are surveys that are done that says, as recently as 20 years ago, anywhere from 80 to 90% of people say they believe in a higher power. They consider themselves to be people of faith. Well, faith without works is dead. As people of faith, it is incumbent for us not just to pray, but to act, to get out and to do something about what we see happening. That comes in the form of protesting, that comes in the form of voting, that comes in the form of moving forward and talking about the things that are really going on, like what we're doing tonight. And then doing something else, bringing someone else to the table, making things happen. And I think that that's what's really going to bring about the changes that we all really hope for and know that we need. Changes in the school system, changes in our criminal justice system, changes in our medical system, changes in the ways we do business every single day. That's where people of faith are really going to make the difference. It's one of the things I always say to you and other students is, don't take this course just because you want to get a grade and a degree, a piece of paper. Take what you learn in here and do it out there. That's what our faith is about. It's not simply, oh, I got it, I got mine, I hope you get yours. We are the people who are supposed to go out and share it with others, bring others into the fold if we can, transform their hearts and their minds, and help them to be better than they were before they encountered us. That's what I think people of faith really can and hopefully will do.
Thank you. As always, I'm inspired. I'm wondering, we've talked about a lot of tough questions so far this evening, and we're going to soon open up for some audience questions. But I wanted to end on another tough one. A lot of people in this Zoom room are Jewish and are concerned by what we've experienced and perceived to be very, rhetoric, particularly in the Black community, that is anti-Semitic. And I'm curious if you can maybe share kind of your perspective on this, and what role anti-Semitism kind of plays in the discourse surrounding race in this country, and particularly coming from the Black community and sometimes also Black Christians.
Sure. I'm glad you brought that up because from the time I was a little boy, as I told you, my parents were so young that I was primarily raised by my great grandfather, my mother's grandfather. And negative rhetoric towards Jewish people would come from my grandfather all the time. He never used any like racial epithets or anything like that, but he would say little things to me like, no matter what you do, don't trust a Jew. And I never understood that. Like, what? Until later, as I got older, I started to talk with more people in the African American community and came to understand that many people in the African American community do not understand the Jewish community. And so there is a degree of negativity towards the Jewish community with regard to the prosperity and the wealth and the health and the unison of the community. And so you fast forward 35, 40 years later, a lot of that rhetoric still exists because, believe it or not, what I honestly think is you have two of the most oppressed peoples on the face of the earth that should be working hand in hand to bring about like change across this country and across the world in ways that no civilization has ever seen. And yet there's still kind of silos because there is still that lack of understanding of the history, lack of understanding of the struggle, lack of understanding the fact that Jewish people still endure an enormous amount of persecution and continued anti-Semitism in this country and around the world. And so I think that a lot of faith leaders, one of the things that they need to do is start bringing the Christian community, particularly the African American Christian community, together with the Jewish community and having real conversations. Let's talk about our history. Let's talk about not just our individual histories, but let's talk about our history together and our history right now, our perceptions of one another, things we've heard, things we've said, things that we've bought into, and how we can change that. And it's one of the reasons that I am so proud that as the chief of police, I was able to work with the Anti-Defamation League and continue to this day to work with the Anti-Defamation League to really help educate communities across Connecticut and across hopefully this entire land about the fact that we must work together as communities and we must understand one another's histories. Because if we don't, not only are we doomed to repeat those histories, the likelihood is we'll be the ones who are taking one another out before anyone else will. So I think it's more important than ever as communities of faith that we get together with one another and that we really talk and see one another, hear one another, and understand one another.
Thank you. And before we open up to audience questions, I just want to express my personal gratitude because I feel like I've had such a privilege of being in class with you and learning from you. And that's definitely shaped the way that I walk through the world. And you've really been an excellent role model for me over our class together and hopefully for the many people who are spending this evening together with us. So I invite anybody who would like to post questions to me in the chat and I will share them. We already have a few. And I wanted to start by asking you, how do you, and we actually talked about this in class, the question was, how do you attract the best and brightest these days despite negative public opinion? And you mentioned when we talked about it in class that it is particularly difficult right now. And this seems to be a struggle for the police department. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about recruitment and current training and people's kind of interest in joining the police force and what maybe this struggle to recruit new officers might mean for the future of policing.
Sure. It is extremely difficult these days to recruit people in policing. In 1998, when I joined the police department, you had to take a test. 4,000 people had taken the test for 42 slots. 3 years later, after 9/11, we continued recruitment. We got 600 applications. This last recruitment drive that the New Haven Police Department did, I was told by one of the people working on the recruitment group that they had 325 applications. You need to get a lot of applications because through the process, you wind up with, if you get 300, that means that'll whittle down to maybe 30 people to have in your pool. And then you do backgrounds from there and you lose a lot of other people. Most people are not looking to become police officers these days because the profession has gotten harder. It's gotten a lot harder in the 22, 23 years that I've been part of it, because you turn on the TV and you see George Floyd, you see protests, you see a lot of negative things associated with policing, but you don't always see the good parts. You know, the opportunity to touch someone's life, to be there in the most vulnerable, most difficult times of their lives, and to offer them hope, and to offer them guidance, and to be there with them in this difficult situation. So from a recruitment standpoint, to recruit the best and brightest, what we've been doing is we're trying to reach people. You know, we're going to college campuses. We are going into the communities where we haven't been before to really say, come and work with us to bring about the change that you want to see. We're reaching out to the Black community in ways that we haven't before. We're reaching out to communities that normally police departments are not known to reach out to. And what we want to do is to make our force more diverse and get the best and brightest who are not simply going to just put the uniform and badge on with the mindset of I'm going out to do law enforcement, but people who have a mindset of being a guardian for the community, someone who's going to go out and bring about change in the community by bringing their best to the table.
Awesome. Thank you. One of our participants is a social worker, and they are wondering if New Haven has been looking to use mental health professionals to intervene in crisis situations, and if that kind of has been effective, and what your experience with that has been like.
New Haven, under Mayor Justin Eliker's leadership, is proposing to have exactly that, a crisis response team that would be made of social workers and clinicians who would be able to respond to those who are having a mental crisis in the community. Rather than sending police, you would have that resource respond. It is still in its development stage, but here at Yale University, one of the things that we've been doing as part of our differential response is that during the day, we have clinicians as part of our mental health plan. And so we formed a crisis intervention team. These are officers who are not in uniform, they're in plain clothes. They respond in a car that is not a patrol car, and they work with the mental health clinicians to make contact with those who are having crises, particularly students who may be having a crisis, may have posted something saying they want to harm themselves, et cetera. And it has been very successful, to the point where the officers had to transport, really commit a student. And the student said to the officers, I'm so thankful that you're not in uniform. The stigma that comes with police having to come and deal with someone who's having an emotional crisis. But B, they didn't want other people to know that this is something they were dealing with. And by working with the mental health professionals, clinicians, it has been extremely helpful to us, to the point where my boss, Chief Ronell Higgins, is now petitioning the university to hire a new position of clinicians and social workers who would be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to be able to respond with officers for any mental health crisis. So I think we're moving in the right direction, both on the city front and the university front.
Awesome. So I think that's a great example of one of the kinds of reforms that we touched on in a general way. I'm curious if one of our viewers wants to know if you can describe another kind of specific reform that you've implemented while you were chief of police, and share kind of about its success and how scalable you think that reform might be.
One of the biggest reforms, which when you talk about how can we as people of faith make a difference, transparency is so important for a police department because communities will not trust the police unless they feel that when the police say or do something, it will be clear as day that this is the truth or not. And so understanding that transparency and the legitimization of police departments is so important. One of the things I did as the chief was I worked with the clergy to get a grant to acquire body cameras for the department. We did a pilot program, and many of the officers were not happy about the pilot program. Why do we need body cameras? This is going to make it hard. No one's going to want to talk to us if we have body cameras. No, 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 no. But once the pilot program was done, thanks to the hard work that the Clergy Association had done in helping us get the $90,000 grant, the pilot program went so well that I was able to work with the Board of Alders and get them to agree to get body cameras for all of the officers in the department. Not just body cameras, but cell phones also, because the reality is people don't want to call the police department. They don't want to call this, anonymous 911 line and wonder who's going to show up. They want to call their police officer, the officer that they know is not going to harm them, that they trust. And so we got body cameras and cell phones at the same time. We implemented the body cameras. I implemented the body cameras despite the union not being happy about it and protesting. And within 2 months, every police officer said, I will not go out on the street unless I have my body camera. These things are wonderful. They protect us. They show the community what we're doing. We're able to, anytime someone has a dispute and says, oh, the officer did this or said that, we're able to pull up the body camera footage and show it. I was able to get rid of some officers who did not need to be police officers, thanks to the body cameras, and not only get rid of them, but release the footage to the community as to why we were getting rid of them. That level of transparency, when people know that you are walking the walk and not just talking the talk, it brings the community together. People knew that they were safer, not just because we were reducing crime, but because they knew they were safer with the department that had sworn an oath to protect and serve them.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And I wanted to spend the last few minutes maybe dreaming a little bit with you and hearing what your vision for what you think the future of policing in America might hopefully be able to look like.
I think that the future of policing in America is going to look a lot different than the traditional policing that we as Americans are so accustomed to. Will there still be uniformed police officers? Yes, but they will work in tandem with maybe non-uniformed officers, maybe non-armed officers who are trained to deal with some of the situations that you don't necessarily need an armed police officer for. I think that maybe we will get to a place where we have a standard across the board for training our police officers and for police accountability. I think that we will get to a place like many other countries where if an officer is involved in any type of use of force situation, rather than the police doing the investigation, a separate outside agency made of community members and those who have never been law enforcement officials will do the investigation so that there is true transparency. We will get to a place where I believe that people will see the police behind them and not worry, no matter what race they are, no matter what gender, sexual orientation, no matter what immigrant status they may be at that time. I think that we are finally at a place where we are cognizant enough or woke enough to be able to say, we can do better. My God, we can do better, and we must. And so I dream of a police department where my kids will never have to have the talk, where they will never have to teach their kids, keep your hands on the wheel, roll the windows down. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. No matter what is said or done, you just do it, where they will know that if they are pulled over, if they are stopped, that they are safe, because that person who has stopped them is an advocate, is a person who is for them and not against them, and is a person who will truly protect and serve them no matter what. We can do it. That's what I dream about. That's what I believe can happen. And that's why every day when I come to work and put on my bulletproof vest, I say, you know what? Let's go make it happen.
Amen. Thank you so much for joining us. For joining us this evening. It really has been so special for me, and I'm sure so many of us. There were so many questions that we didn't have a chance to answer, and I hope that over the course of our year of very active listening together, we'll have other opportunities to touch on these topics. And really, thank you so much, Officer Campbell, for joining us tonight. Everybody who has registered will receive a follow-up email with a feedback form and recommended follow-up reading recommended by Officer Campbell, and also information about our upcoming events. Yoval's next event will be on December 22nd with Dr. Rivka Press-Schwartz on the topic of everything you ever wanted to know about Orthodox Jews and race, but were afraid to ask. To register, we are going to share a link in the chat momentarily. Please click that link to register. Also, if you appreciate Yoval and any of our other amazing programs that we have regularly run and continue to run through our pandemic, please note that this is a great time to become a member or to renew your membership, or to consider associate membership for those of you who are benefiting from remote events but are not maybe showing up in person, or who have never been a member before. Information about registering and becoming a member and an associate member are also going to be posted momentarily in the chat. We just thank you so much for joining us, Officer Campbell, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We look forward to continuing to learn and listen together with you. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Aura. Great job.
Officer. Thank you so much. This was so special. I really appreciate it.
So proud of you. So proud of you. Great job.
I'll talk soon.
Know it.